GIS Fundamentals, Section 13, Spatial Models and Modeling. A model is a description of reality. Models describe the basic properties or processes for a set of spatial features, and help us understand their form and behavior. Many computer-based models use spatial data, and are developed and run using some combination of GIS, general and specialized computer programming languages, and spatial and non-spatial analytical tools. Spatially explicit models are a primary benefit of GIS technologies, and many spatial models are based on data in a GIS. These models may be run in the GIS, or the spatial data may be prepared in a GIS and exported to a model that is developed and run outside a GIS. We split spatial models into three broad and overlapping classes: cartographic models, simple spatial models, and spatio-temporal models. Joseph Barry described cartographic models as automating manual map analysis and processing, while spatial models focus on applying mathematical relationships. Cartographic models are most often applied to rank areas in support of decision-making, while simple spatial models often apply sets of equations to predict a specific continuous variable across space. Cartographic model outputs are often nominal, or ordinal, while the outputs from simple spatial models are often interval ratio. Cartographic models solve problems via spatial layer combination in overlay, buffers, reclassification, and other spatial operations. These models often employ the concepts of map algebra. Suitability analysis, defined here as the classification of land according to their utility for specific uses, are among the most common cartographic models. Most cartographic models are temporarily static because they represent spatial features at a fixed point in time. Cartographic models are generally not temporally dynamic, even though they may be used to analyze change. For example, we may wish to analyze vegetation change over a 10-year period, based largely on vegetation maps produced at the start and end of the period. Each data layer represents the vegetation boundaries at a fixed point in time. The model is static in that the polygon boundaries for a given layer do not change. There may be two vegetation data layers, each corresponding to a different point in time, and the vegetation boundaries are mapped as found at each time interval. Our cartographic model includes a temporal component in that it compares vegetation change through time, but the cartographic model does not generate new boundaries of polygons or any other characteristics of spatial features. Boundaries may be a composite of those lines that exist in the input data layers, but new lines at new coordinate locations are not generated. Most spatial modeling or models conducted in the framework of GIS have been cartographic models that are temporarily static in this manner. Simple spatial models typically apply a set of equations to spatially resolved variables. They often rest on equations developed from data at a set of observations at points or sub-areas and then applied across broader geographic areas. Simple spatial models typically include a model derived through sampling and a statistical fitting process, a model that is subsequently applied across space to estimate important events, densities, or other characteristics. Spatio-temporal models are dynamic in both space and time. They differ from cartographic or predictive spatial models in that time passes explicitly within the running of the model, and changes in time-driven processes within the model cause changes in spatial variables. Spatio-temporal models often attempt to explicitly represent processes within the model. The actions of objects as they move across an environment may also be represented in a spatio-temporal model. Spatio-temporal models include time-driven processes within the framework of the model. These processes are typically quite detailed and include substantial computer code to represent important subprocesses. Spatio-temporal models are typically more limited than other modeling approaches in the range and number of spatial themes analyzed, but they provide a more mechanistic representation of dynamic processes. These temporally dynamic models explicitly calculate the changes in the output spatial variables through time. Simple spatial models and spatial statistical analysis are often used as precursors to spatio-temporal models. By uncovering key processes or rates, they can guide further analysis. Cartographic modeling. A cartographic model provides information through a combination of spatial datasets, functions, and operations. These functions and operations often include reclassification, overlay, interpolation, terrain analysis, buffering, and other functions. Multiple data layers are combined via these operations, and the information is typically in the form of a spatial data layer. Map algebra is often used to specify cartographic models for raster datasets. Suitability analysis are perhaps the most common examples of cartographic models. These analyses rank land according to its utility for various purposes. Cartographic models are often succinctly represented by flowcharts. A flowchart is a graphic representation of the spatial data, operations, and their sequence of use in a cartographic model. Flowcharts aid in the conceptualization and comparison of various competing approaches and may aid in the selection of the final model. Cartographic modeling often produces a large number of intermediate or temporary data layers that are not required in the final output or decision making. Designing the best cartographic model to solve a problem, the selection of the appropriate spatial tools, and the specification of their sequence is perhaps the most important and often the most difficult process in cartographic modeling. Designing a cartographic model. General or qualitative criteria may be provided, and these must be converted to specific quantitative measures. The conversion from a qualitative to quantitative specification is often an iterative process, with repeated interaction between the analyst developing and applying the cartographic model, and the manager or decision maker who will act on the resultant information. Weightings and rankings. While some cartographic models are simple and restrictive, many more cartographic models require the combination of criteria that vary across a range of values, and require an explicit ranking of the relative importance of different classes or types of criteria. Once criteria are precisely defined, we must obtain appropriate data, develop a flowchart or plan for our analysis, and address the more difficult problem of assigning rankings within each criteria, and assigning the relative weightings among criteria. Rankings within criteria. Each criterion is usually expressed by a data layer or criterion layer. Each criterion layer is a spatial representation of some constraint or selection condition. We must explicitly formalize our ranking for each layer used to represent a criterion. One early decision is whether ranks should be discrete or continuous. Rankings are discrete when input data are interpreted such that the criterion data layer is a map of discrete values. Ranks are continuous when they vary along a scale. For example, soils may be rated from 1 to 100 for construction suitability. Discrete rankings are most often used when there are clear, discrete classes to be represented in criteria. A disease may be present or absent, a country an ally or enemy, or a block inventoried or not. The values to be represented are discrete categories. Continuous rankings provide a range of values to characterize a suitability or restriction, and they result in a set of incrementally varying ranks. Ranks, or scores, typically range over a real or large integer interval. For example, from 0 to 1 or 0 to 1000. Highest suitability is usually assigned to the highest rank and lowest to the bottom. Weighting among criteria. Distinct criteria must be combined in many spatial analysis, usually in some overlay or addition process. We must choose how to weight one layer relative to another. Because the criteria will be combined in a suitability data layer, the relative weightings given each criterion will influence the results. Different relative weights are likely to result in different suitability rankings. The assignment of relative weightings is easiest when the importance of the various criteria may be expressed on a common scale, such as money. Reducing all criteria to a common scale removes differential weighting among criteria. Many rankings are based on variables that are difficult to quantify. Multiple model runs may be required, each run with a different set of relative weights within and among criteria. One method of assigning weights is based on their importance ranking. The numerator of equation is calculated for each criterion, giving the most important criterion the highest value and the least important the lowest value. The denominator is calculated by summation, and then the individual weights calculated as shown in the rightmost column. Simple spatial models. Predictive spatial models are commonly applied, particularly when there is a well-established model based on point or small-scale observations and analysis, and when the output is a continuous variable. For example, temperature, housing value, soil erosion rates, or cancer frequency. Simple spatial models typically are based on one or a few equations. Simple spatial models are often based on small area studies for which all variables may be easily measured. This is often not true when applying the models to larger areas. Spatio-temporal models. Spatio-temporal models have been developed and applied in a number of disciplines. Spatio-temporal models use spatially explicit inputs to calculate or predict spatially explicit outputs. Rules, functions, or some other processes are applied using spatial and often non-spatial data. Input variables such as elevation, vegetation type, human population density, or rainfall may be used as inputs to one or more mathematical equations. These equations are then used to calculate a value for one or more spatial locations. The values are often saved in a spatial data format, such as a layer in a GIS. Spatio-temporal models involve at least a three-dimensional representation of one or more key attributes. Variation in planar, or XY space, and through time. A fourth dimension may be added if the vertical Z direction is also modeled. Spatio-temporal models may also be classified by a number of other criteria, whether they treat continuous fields or discontinuous objects, if they are process-based or rely on purely fit models, and if they are stochastic or deterministic. Combinations of these model characteristics lead to a broad array of spatio-temporal model types. Models of continuous phenomena predict values that vary smoothly across time or space. Air temperature, precipitation, soil moisture, and atmospheric pollutants are examples of continuous variables that are predicted using spatio-temporal models. Models of discrete phenomena predict spatial or attribute characteristics for discontinuous features. Boundaries for vegetation types are an example of features that are often considered discrete. We use a line to identify the separation between two types. Models are considered process-based if their workings in some way represent a theoretical or mechanistic understanding of the processes underlying the observed changes. And models are purely fit models when they do not. Models may be stochastic or deterministic. A deterministic model provides the same outputs every time it is given exactly the same inputs. A stochastic model will not. Stochastic models often have random generation or some other variability generation procedures that change model results from run to run, even when using exactly the same inputs. Cell-based models. Spatial temporal models often are implemented as cell-based models. A cell-based model invokes a set of functions and logic driven by cell values to update these or other cell values through time. Input values at a starting time may be derived from multiple layers. These input values are entered into functions that calculate the new values for the target layer or layers at the next time step. The process is then repeated, and the values in the target layers evolve through time. Cellular automata are one of the simplest forms of cell-based models. Cellular automata operate on a single cell-based layer, using simple rules to derive the next state from the current state. Cells typically have two states, on and off, or dark and light. The cell is on or off in the next step, depending on the arrangement of on-off cells in the vicinity of the target cells. Cell values at each time step completely determine the cell pattern in the next time step. Most temporarily dynamic cell-based models are more complex than cellular automata. Agent-based modeling. Agent-based models are a third type of spatio-temporal model, often applied in cell-based environments. Also known as individual-based models, these systems contain agents that may move across digital landscapes. The landscape is often described by a set of variables stored in cells. Agents may range across this grid, reacting to the environment or to other agents according to a small set of pre-described rules. Complex behaviors may be exhibited from relatively simple sets of few rules. Agent-based models are currently active areas of research and application, primarily in pedestrian and motorized transportation analysis and in conservation biology. Many spatio-temporal hydrologic models predict the temporal fluctuations in soil moisture, lake or stream water levels, and discharge in hydrologic networks. Spatially explicit hydrologic models are almost universally dependent on digital elevation data. DEMs are used to define watershed boundaries, water flow paths, the speed of downslope movement, and stream location. Slope, aspect, and other factors that affect hydrologic systems may be derived from DEMs. Slope and aspect are often used to define an important spatial data layer in hydrologic modeling: flow direction. Many spatio-temporal hydrologic models adopt a raster data structure. Raster data structures preserve variation in surface elevation that drives water movements. Landis is a stochastic model of forest change. Many human or natural phenomena are analyzed through spatially explicit stochastic models. Disease spread, the development of past societies, animal movement, fire spread, and a host of other important spatial phenomena have been modeled. All these phenomena have a random element that substantially affects their behavior. Spatially explicit stochastic models allow us to analyze the relative importance of component inputs and processes and the nature and variability of system response. Landis incorporates natural and human disturbances with models of seed dispersal, plant establishment, and succession through time to predict forest composition over broad spatial scales and for its long temporal scales. Landis has been used to model forest dynamics at a 30-meter resolution over tens of thousands of hectares and across 5 centuries. Landis integrates information about forest disturbance and succession to predict changes in forest composition. Succession is the replacement of species through time. Landis design elements. Landis is an object-oriented model. Specific features or processes are encapsulated in objects, and object internal processes are isolated as much as possible from other portions of the model. GIS Fundamentals, Section 13, Spatial Models and Modeling, Section Summary. Spatial analysis often involves the development of spatial models. These models can help us understand how phenomena or systems change through space and time, and they may be used to solve problems. In this chapter, we described cartographic models and spatio-temporal models. Cartographic models often combine several data layers to satisfy a set of criteria. Data layers are combined through the application of a sequence of spatial operations, including overlay, reclassification, and buffering. The cartographic model may be specified with a flowchart, a diagram representing the data layers and sequence of spatial operations. Cartographic models are static in time relative to other model types. Spatio-temporal models explicitly represent the changes in important phenomena through time within the model. These models are typically more detailed and less flexible than cartographic models, in part because spatio-temporal models often include some representation of process. For example, many spatio-temporal models have been developed to model the flow of water through a region, and these models incorporate equations regarding the physics of water transport movement. Models may be stochastic or deterministic, process-based or statistical, or they may have a combination of these characteristics.